If you listen closely to the summer of 1944, beneath the roar of distant battlefields and the grinding machinery of a world still at war, you can hear something unexpected, a quieter, steadier rhythm as nations gather not to fight, but to imagine the architecture of the peace that would follow. Soldiers were still dying in Europe and the Pacific, yet in a secluded corner of New Hampshire, representatives from 44 countries arrived with stacks of papers, battered briefcases, and the weight of global collapse on their shoulders. They came seeking an answer to a question that haunted the 20th century. How do you rebuild a world where 2 wars and a depression have shattered trust in markets, currencies, governments, and even the idea of progress itself? The hotel where they met, the Mount Washington Hotel, stood like a sanctuary amid the White Mountains. Its polished wood floors, echoing hallways, and grand ballroom became the crucible in which a new global order would be forged. The setting had an almost cinematic quality. Economists scribbling equations on notepads, diplomats arguing through interpreters, secretaries racing between sessions with updated proposals. Outside, the peaceful July air belied the urgency inside, because what was at stake was nothing less than the economic future of humanity. World War II had not just devastated cities, it had upended financial systems. Europe was drowning in debt, currencies were unstable, gold reserves depleted, and trade flows fractured. The Great Depression had shown that when countries retreat into tariffs, devaluations, and competitive isolation, the global economy collapses like a house of cards. The Allies knew that if they repeated the mistakes of the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds, they would plant the seeds of another catastrophe. The next peace would need more than treaties, it would need institutions, rules, cooperation, and a mechanism to prevent nations from sinking into beggar thy neighbor policies the moment hardship returned. 2 men emerged as the intellectual giants of the conference, standing like opposing poles of magnetic force. John Maynard Keynes representing Britain, and Harry Dexter White representing the United States. Keynes, once the prophet of the Depression, now walked with the quiet fragility of a man whose health was failing, but whose mind remained luminous. Britain, exhausted by war, burdened by debt, and losing its financial hegemony, needed a system that allowed flexibility, capital controls, generous credit, and room to breathe. White, younger and harder-edged, carried the confidence of a rising superpower. The United States, flush with gold and industrial might, wanted a system that tethered global finance to stability and disciplined monetary policy. If the 19th century had been British, the 20th was unmistakably American, and White negotiated with that inevitability humming beneath his words. Their visions collided. Keynes proposed a supranational currency bancor that would prevent any one nation from dominating global finance. White rejected it. The dollar, anchored to gold, would be the world's reserve currency. America, after financing the war and emerging as the world's creditor, would become the linchpin of the new system. It was a subtle power shift wrapped in the language of cooperation. Yet, even Keynes, with his characteristic blend of realism and eloquence, understood the truth. Britain needed American support far more than America needed British acquiescence. So the negotiations continued, not as a clash of equals, but as a careful crafting of a future where the U.S. dollar would quietly inherit the economic throne once held by the British pound. As the debates stretched late into the night, one principle gained consensus. The world could no longer rely on the rigidity of the pre-1914 gold standard. But neither could it survive the chaos of the interwar free-for-all. The solution would be a middle path fixity with flexibility. Exchange rates would be fixed but adjustable. Currencies would peg to the US dollar, and the dollar in turn would be convertible into gold at $35 an ounce. It was an elegant compromise. Stability without suffocation. But Bretton Woods was more than an exchange rate regime. It was the birth of institutions that would shape global finance for generations. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and later the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. These were not mere bureaucracies. They were the scaffolding of a new world designed to prevent the desperation that had once driven nations into extremism. The IMF would serve as a financial firefighter, stepping in when countries faced balance of payments crises. The World Bank would rebuild shattered economies. And though the GATT came slightly later, its DNA was present in Bretton Woods, a commitment to lowering trade barriers and avoiding the self-inflicted wounds of protectionism. I often imagine the mood on the final night of the conference. Exhaustion hung in the air. Delegates rubbed their temples, their suits wrinkled, their eyes bloodshot from weeks of debate. Yet, beneath the fatigue was a glimmer of something rare: hope. Not the naive hope of the 1,920 seconds, but a sober, scarred, determined hope born from catastrophe. They had not designed a perfect system, only a better one, a system that recognized the psychological fragility of markets, the political temptations of nationalism, and the need for collective discipline. When the agreement was signed on the 22nd of July 1944, applause filled the ballroom. Photographers flashed bulbs. Journalists scribbled headlines. Outside, the mountains stood indifferent, as mountains do. Yet history had shifted inside those walls. The world now had a monetary anchor, not gold alone, not sovereignty alone, but a hybrid architecture tethered to cooperation and the strength of the American economy. Still, even in its triumph, Bretton Woods carried an inherent tension, one that would become more obvious as the decades passed. The system relied on the United States to supply enough dollars for global trade, yet also required America to maintain confidence in those dollars through discipline. It was a paradox Keynes himself recognized. The system's success would depend on the very imbalance that made it possible. And as Europe rebuilt, as Japan industrialized, as global trade surged, pressures began to accumulate quietly, slowly, like tectonic plates beneath the surface. For no system, no matter how visionary, can escape the gravity of its contradictions that would eventually press upon the world economy until the foundation of Bretton Woods began to crack under the strain of its own success, revealing that even the most carefully engineered systems carry within them the seeds of future upheaval. For as the world pushed deeper into the post-war decades, the mechanisms designed at Bretton Woods, stable exchange rates, dollar convertibility, and coordinated monetary discipline, found themselves confronting economic realities that the architects of 1944 could not fully anticipate. What had been built to prevent another Great Depression soon found itself struggling against forces of reconstruction, globalization, and political ambition that threatened to tear its foundations apart. In the first years after the war, the system operated smoothly precisely because the dollar was scarce. Europe was devastated, Japan lay in ruins, and the rest of the world depended heavily on American capital to rebuild. The Marshall Plan, the expansion of trade, and the revival of industrial production all flowed through the bloodstream of the U.S. financial system. This imbalance, America rich in dollars, the world desperate for them, allowed the United States to act simultaneously as banker, architect, and guarantor of global stability. In those early years, the gold-dollar link felt solid, almost eternal. A dollar was as good as gold because the world believed America would always be disciplined enough, strong enough, and cautious enough to protect that promise. But as the 1,950 seconds turned into the 1,960 seconds, recovery transformed into resurgence. Europe rebuilt with astonishing speed. Japan rose from the ashes of defeat into a manufacturing powerhouse. Global trade expanded. Productivity soared. And as nations grew richer, they no longer needed to absorb dollars passively. They began accumulating them first cautiously, then aggressively. The world was now flush with dollars, but America, feeling the familiar temptations of prosperity and geopolitical responsibility, began to loosen its fiscal discipline. The result was the famous Triffin dilemma, named after economist Robert Triffin, who exposed the structural flaw at the heart of Bretton Woods. For the world to have enough dollars to function, the United States had to run deficits. But the more dollars America supplied, the more other nations doubted whether those dollars could truly be redeemed for gold at $35 an ounce. It was a trap with no elegant escape. To maintain the system, America had to undermine it. By the early 1960 seconds, the cracks were no longer subtle. Gold outflows accelerated. European central banks, most notably France under Charles de Gaulle, began converting their excess dollars into gold, questioning why the United States should enjoy the privilege of printing the world's reserve currency while others bore the risks. De Gaulle called it America's exorbitant privilege, a phrase that would echo through decades of debate. Meanwhile, inflationary pressure stirred within the U.S. economy as government spending climbed not only on domestic programs, but on the escalating war in Vietnam. Bretton Woods had been built on the assumption of American discipline. Now that assumption was dissolving in real time. By 1967, speculation against the dollar intensified. Gold markets shook. Rumors spread. The London Gold Pool, a cooperative arrangement designed to stabilize the gold price, collapsed under the weight of speculative pressure. The U.S. insisted it would maintain convertibility, but the math grew more brutal by the month. There were simply too many dollars in the world and too little gold to back them. The credibility of the system was eroding, slowly but unmistakably, like the tide pulling sand from beneath a seawall. And then came the breaking point. On the 15th of August, 1971, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation in a televised announcement whose calm tone belied the magnitude of the event. With inflation rising, gold reserves dwindling, and confidence collapsing, Nixon declared a temporary suspension of dollar convertibility into gold. The dollar was no longer redeemable. The $35 anchor was gone. With a single sentence, he severed the umbilical cord linking Bretton Woods to the old world of gold-based stability. The shock rippled across every boardroom, trading floor, and central bank on Earth. The Bretton Woods system, carefully negotiated, painstakingly constructed, globally celebrated, was effectively dead. In the months and years that followed, currencies floated, exchange rates gyrated, inflation surged across multiple continents. The 1,970 seconds became an era of economic turbulence, oil shocks, wage price spirals, monetary confusion, all emerging from the vacuum left by the collapse of fixed exchange rates. Yet, in this turmoil, a new philosophy of global finance began to take shape. A world where markets, rather than governments, would determine currency values. Where central banks would target inflation rather than gold parity. Where the dollar, still dominant but now untethered, would rise as the central pillar of a flexible, modern financial order. And ironically, the collapse of Bretton Woods did not diminish the dollar's global role. It entrenched it. Without convertibility, the dollar became the world's primary store of liquidity, the currency of commodities, trade, and international reserves. What had been built as a hybrid system evolved into something far more sweeping, a dollar-based global economy in which the United States could finance deficits, project power, and weather crises with a resilience no other nation could match. If Bretton Woods established American leadership, its collapse cemented American dominance. Looking back, the Bretton Woods Agreement stands as one of the most ambitious experiments in economic history, a grand attempt to stabilize a fractured world through cooperation, discipline, and shared rules. It succeeded for a generation, long enough to rebuild continents and prevent another depression. But it also revealed the eternal truth of monetary systems. They are only as strong as the political and economic realities that sustain them. And when those realities shift, as they inevitably do, no structure, no matter how brilliant, can survive unchanged. Yet Bretton Woods left a legacy that outlived its mechanisms. The creation of international institutions, the expectation of cooperation, the idea that global stability is a collective responsibility. Its spirit, if not its structure, continues to shape every debate over currencies, central banks, crises, and the fragile balance between national sovereignty and global interdependence. If this journey into the birth, life, and fall of Bretton Woods stirred insights or raised questions, share what resonated with you. And if you want more cinematic explorations of how finance has bent the arc of history, follow the channel to join the next chapter of this long, unfolding economic saga.